And you'll spotlight Rachel and me?
Yes.
Okay. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the library today on this hot day. I don't know where you are, but it's about 90 degrees in New York. My name's Carol Stern, and I'm a librarian here at the Glen Cove Public Library. Before we start, I'd just like to tell you about the next month's author. It's August 6th at 2 o'clock. We're having Roxana Robinson. She wrote Leaving, another very good book. So mark your calendars. So Rachel Beanland is the author of two novels, which I loved both of them. The House is on Fire and Florence Adler Swims Forever. The House is on Fire, which came out in April, was selected as an Indie Next Pick by the American Booksellers Association, a GMA Buzz Pick by Good Morning America, a most anticipated book by the Washington Post, and one of the best books of 2023 by NPR and the New Yorker. Rachel attended the University of South Carolina and earned an MFA in creative writing in Virginia Commonwealth University. She is the 2023-24 writer in residence at the University of Richmond. She lives in Virginia with her husband and 3 children. So if you have any questions, there's a chat. We'll try to get to all the questions at the end of the discussion. And if you want, you can unmute yourself at the end of the discussion also. So hi, Rachel. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Can you talk about what inspired you to write The House is on Fire and how you learned about the Richmond Theater Fire?
Yeah, absolutely. I uh I learned about the Richmond Theater Fire the very first day I showed up in Richmond, Virginia, actually, which is um pretty ironic because I talked to lots of people in Richmond, ever since the book has come out. I talked to lots of people who have lived in Richmond 30, 40, 50 years, and they'll say, I never knew about the Richmond Theater Fire. I can't believe it. But I happened to come down. I was on a job interview, and you know how sometimes they'll send one of these realtors, to drive you around and show you neighborhoods before you're really ready to buy a house, but just kind of giving you the lay of the land, as you're thinking about moving here. And we knew we were coming. My husband had already taken a job, and so it was just a question of me finding one. And I'm sorry, I have my dog in the office, and he's decided he's going to be a little loud. Um, but so this realtor was driving me around, kind of showing me Richmond, and showed me the Fan, which is an old neighborhood, in the city, and then we were driving down Broad Street toward Church Hill, another very old neighborhood in Richmond, and we passed Monumental Church, and he said, just kind of pointed out the window and said there used to be a theater here. And the theater, he knew a decent bit about the theater, considering that, he was not a historian, he was a realtor. He knew that there had been a fire in the middle of a performance, that a lot of people had been trapped inside, that the governor of Virginia had died in the fire, that, it had been, just a very like large scale, event in terms of casualties. Um, and he knew that the victims of the fire had been buried in what became, the crypt of the church, and that the church had been built as a monument to those who had perished in the fire. So, it was a good bit. And I was 26 at the time. I was a long way from writing my first novel. I had certainly tried to write novels by then. I had like Word documents saved on my computer, right? But I had a lot to learn still. And I remember though thinking that this was a really incredible story, that it had all of the kind of components that I love it when I read a novel. So I think, if he had told me that day, oh, there's a novel about the Richmond Theater Fire, I would have run right out and bought it. Um, but I just went on my merry way and got to know Richmond better, and did eventually get a job, um and for a long time I was just kind of writing on the side. I'm sorry guys, I have a summer cold, so it's actually great that we're meeting virtually. But so that all was happening in 2007, And then, fast forward 13 years, I, had written Florence Adler Swims Forever. It had sold to Simon and Schuster. There is a very long lead time when you are waiting for your first novel to come out in the world. And so I had all this time to think about what my next novel would be about. And I had actually started working on something else. And then, of course, we rolled right into that pandemic, right? March 2020. Florence Adler was still 4 months from being released. And I started to get a little nervous. Initially we were going to go into our homes and just flatten the curve for a couple of weeks. Remember that? And when that kind of failed to do much and it became clear that we were going to be in our houses a lot longer than 2 weeks, I got very nervous because the book that I was in the middle of working on was one that was going to require a lot of travel to get right. And, there were no planes in the sky. I was just thinking, when am I ever going to get to go anywhere again? I didn't know if I would ever get to go anywhere again. And I started to think that it might be the right time to write something that was set in my own backyard, that was set much closer to home, where I could do all of the research and work I needed to, to write a really engaging story. And so that it was really that thought exercise that kind of led me back to the Richmond Theater Fire 13 years after I had heard about it. I had always paid attention to, the fire when it would kind of come up in local news, or in 2011 we celebrated celebrate is kind of the wrong word, memorialized the 200th anniversary of the fire. And so there were some bits in the paper and the local TV stations then. And then in 2012, Meredith Henny Baker's book came out, and she wrote a nonfiction account of the fire. And so she was kind of doing the circuit, talking about that. So, periodically I had heard about the Richmond Theater Fire, but it wasn't until 2020 that I really sat down and I read Meredith Henny Baker's book, and I did kind of started to do a deep dive into not just the fire, but the time period. And I very quickly realized, oh yeah, it would make a fabulous novel.
So just to be a little diverse, did you ever get in touch with this realtor to tell him you wrote a book that he told you to
No,
write?
you know what? I totally lost touch with the realtor.
So he has no
I
idea.
don't even know if he still works in, real estate. I have no idea, but no, yeah.
So how did you find all the information you found? Like, how did you, how did you gather all the information about the fire? If you were stuck in your house.
Yeah, I was very lucky that there are a number of really rich archives in Richmond. The Library of Virginia has a lot of information about the fire, and also just about kind of Jeffersonian Virginia in general. And then the Virginia Museum of History and Culture is also in Richmond, and also had archives. And the archivists in both of these places were really devoted to keeping the collection open during the pandemic. And I think that's something we can kind of like applaud all librarians for, was trying to come up with innovative ways for us to still be able to get our hands on books and materials. And so I would kind of go into these archives with my mask, and they'd have a mask and they'd slide me things, but I never had to get on a plane, so that was good. And what's funny, the more work I did in terms of researching the book, the more I realized that it was helpful that I was in Richmond to write this book, but I could have been in Boston, I could have been in New York, I could have been in Philadelphia, I could have even been in London. And a lot of the same materials end up in other archives in these other cities, because what we don't really realize when we hear the words the Richmond Theater Fire, we think, okay, small event that happened in Virginia. But actually, the Richmond Theater Fire was a national and even international event when it happened. There had never been a calamity like this before, in terms of a single one-day loss of life, in an urban setting. And it captured the nation's attention. And so a lot of the same documents that I was finding in Virginia, the copies of the inquest report, copies of city council minutes, lists of the dead, all of these kind of the pieces of reportage about the fire, they all also appeared in all of these other cities. These printers would put together commemorative books about the Richmond Theater Fire, and people would buy them to have kind of everything about the fire in one place. Or there were engravings that were for sale in all of these cities. You had ministers at churches in these various, northern cities giving sermons about the Richmond Theater Fire and what it meant, right? Because, of course, lots of people thought that the reason that Richmond had this happen to them was because they were not godly enough. And so, ministers kind of seized onto it and said, oh, this'll be a really good, Sunday sermon. But yeah, it was shocking. And the headlines, in that day did not move so quickly as they do now, right? So when we talk about a 24-hour news cycle now, and even like really it's like a 2-hour news cycle, I feel like some days, but everything was slower, information was slower to travel. So the Richmond Theater Fire stayed in the headlines for months.
Just to talk about your writing process, do you write an outline when you write, or and how long did it take you to write this book?
It took me about 2 years, a little less than 2 years, maybe. Um, with the research, I mean, definitely, I think 2 years would be fair. And I go back and forth. I like a little outlining in the beginning to kind of get me off to a good start. So, as I was thinking about, okay, this book obviously starts with the fire. So I had kind of a list of kind of points I needed to hit for those first, the early scenes with the fire. I knew, I had these 4 characters and I needed them to get to certain places by the end of the fire, right? So that the story could be kind of ready to go. So, I did a little outlining in the beginning, but overall, I find if I outline too much, then I lose some of the magic when it comes to writing. I always have a sense of where I'm going in terms of like, I have a vision, just almost like an image of where I want the book to get to by the end. And maybe I don't know what's going to happen to every character, but I have some sense of like, this is what I'm writing toward. And that I find to be very helpful. I don't know that I would call that outlining, but I do have some sense of vision for that. And one technique that other writers have written about and discussed, much more eloquently than I, is this idea of also outlining after you have written a first draft. So you kind of work backwards and kind of look at what you've put down on the page, look at where the story is, and say, okay, this is what I've currently got. What is it missing? How do I fill in the holes? And so that's a technique that I found to be pretty helpful. Kind of a reverse outlining.
The story's told about 4 primary characters. Are they based on true people, or can you talk about the different characters?
Yeah, they're all based on true people, on real people who lived and breathed. So for me, as I was thinking about the 4 characters, I have a young stagehand who's back, behind the scenes, and we know that is where the fire began. So I knew I wanted someone who was witness to the fire, but also was kind of witness to this the inner workings of this theater company, because the theater company was so colorful and also so kind of evil, and that we do know that this theater company did try to blame the fire on a slave revolt. And so that became, I knew I needed someone that was embedded back in that company and that could kind of witness all of this. And there's a reference in the inquest report to this young stagehand. He's not referenced by name, but he's kind of involved. And so I had this idea of this young stagehand, and I loved the idea that he would be young because I thought he'd still be a little malleable, like, not quite sure what the right thing to do was. And so that became Jack Gibson, right? This kid who's, of course, by early 19th century standards, he's a full grown adult, right? They've got 14-year-olds that are working and all the rest of it. He's very much on his own, but of course, by our standards, he's still a kid. So he became, one of the characters I knew I needed. I knew I wanted someone up in a woman. I knew I wanted a woman up in the boxes. The boxes were the hardest seats to escape in the theater. And we know from eyewitness accounts that the women were, in many cases trampled in these kind of narrow hallways. And, they had a very difficult time escaping. And we know from the numbers that many more women died in the fire than men. And so I wanted a woman who was up in those boxes and who could kind of witness what had happened, what had really happened, as opposed to what kind of became the narrative, right? And we know that Sally Henry Campbell, Patrick Henry's daughter, was at the theater the night of the fire. And I used what we do know about her and kind of flipped a few things, but put her there because I liked the fact that she was kind of tangentially related to power, right? That she could get some information if she needed it, that she had some sense of the kind of inner workings of government and had maybe wasn't quite so afraid to ask for some of the answers that were not going to be very readily available, right? I knew I wanted someone in what was called the colored gallery, right? This was a gallery on the second floor with its own entrance for free and enslaved Black theater goers, as well as, quote, drunks and prostitutes. That was, everyone who could sit up there. And the gallery became very interesting to me because when we look at the list of the dead, there are 6 Black and multiracial victims listed among the 72 people. And historians have suspected for some time that some of those 6 Black and multiracial victims may not have died in the fire. They may have used the fire as an alibi to escape slavery. And the reason they think this is because a few of these victims have kind of strange notations next to their names, right? It's a list of the dead. Everyone should be dead, right? And so, all of the white victims just say, the name, right? But for these 6 Black and multiracial victims, a couple of them have these notations. One has the word missing next to it. Another has the phrase supposed to have perished. And so that, of course, got my novelist brain churning. And I was fascinated by this idea that, that the theater fire could have been so terrible for so many people, but could have also, maybe had a silver lining for a couple of people. So Cecily Patterson becomes the young enslaved woman who I follow, who is up in that gallery and who, her whole life changes the night of the fire. And then the last person I chose to focus on was an enslaved blacksmith named Gilbert Hunt, who we actually know a good bit about, in terms of enslaved Black residents of Richmond. Gilbert Hunt, his life is pretty well documented, in part because he was such a hero the night of the Richmond Theater Fire. He saved about a dozen white women from the fire. And that story kind of lived on for, decades and decades. And it was formally written down in 1859, many, many years after the fire. But there's evidence that people knew about what he had done, always, and that it was always kind of part of Richmond's urban legend. And Gilbert just was one of those people that was impossible not to put in the book. Once I read and came to understand his story, I knew he had to go in there. But for all 4 characters, I was very much thinking about kind of where they physically were in the building, and because I wanted to give readers a really good sense of what was happening all around them, so that you could, of course, envision that night, but then also, what happens that night affects everything that is to come.
Could you talk a little more about Gilbert? I know I had read that he had to purchase his freedom and that, he was treated well, but he was still a slave and didn't have a lot of freedom. Can you talk about that a little?
Well, yeah. So my question is, has everyone read the book, or am I going to give stuff away if I talk about Gilbert
I
Hunt?
assume everybody has read the book.
Okay. Okay. All right. I always get nervous when I start talking about Gilbert Hunt because then I'm like giving away some plot points. Um, yeah, I mean, Gilbert Hunt was treated terribly. Like, of course, when you hear that he saved 12 white women from the fire, you think, oh my gosh, there must have been all these families in Richmond that were so, so grateful to him and that owed him everything, right? Um, and the reality is that, Gilbert does not buy his freedom. He is able to buy his freedom, but he does not buy his freedom until 1829. The real Gilbert Hunt. And so, that meant that there were a lot of Richmonders who owed him everything and then were still perfectly content to watch him sit in slavery for the next 20 years. So, after he bought his own freedom, he ended up going to Liberia. He returned to the United States from Liberia. He spent about 8 or 9 months there. And then, at that time, if you had bought your own freedom, you were expected to leave Virginia within a year of purchasing your freedom. And so in his case, though, he received special dispensation to stay in Richmond. And we think a lot of that is due to the fact that he was a hero in the city. So yeah, his life was certainly a very unusual one in certain regards. But then also very typical in others, in that we think that he did, lose his first wife. We can't figure it out, right, exactly, but it's certainly very likely that she was sold or, moved away with her family, the family that owned her. So, yeah, his story's both kind of uplifting in certain ways and then very tragic in others.
He was also taught to read, right? I had read that somewhere.
Yes, yes. So yeah, he was the reason that he was at the fire in the first place that night was because he had his wife, who was owned by another family in town, the Mayos, Prescott Mayos. That kind of she had remarried. They had a young daughter, Louisa Mayo, who was at the theater that night, and so he, upon the kind of request of this matron in the family, he ran to the theater to try to find Louisa Mayo, and this young girl purportedly had taught him to read, and so he did have a kind of special place in his heart for her. At least that's the legend, right? Yeah, which and that's one of the things that you always have to kind of interrogate when you're looking at these stories is not just what happened or what's written down, but who did the writing down, right? Who captured the story, and what might have been the other reasons that they were capturing these stories.
So when you say who was writing it down, so the newspapers were mostly predominantly male or filled with men, no women, right? I mean, it was all
Yeah,
from.
so only white men could write for the papers, and that's certainly one thing that I talk about in the book because it becomes really important when we look at what happened to the women in the fire, for instance. We get all of these narratives in the paper in the days after the fire that are very kind of complimentary to the men, the white men, who were there. And these men, some of whom were at the theater and some of whom were not even at the theater that night, write to the paper and kind of give their their experiences, write about their experiences, and according to them, they all are somehow heroes, right? Like they all did something heroic that night, even if they weren't in the building. They found a woman and put her in a wheelbarrow and took her home, or they all kind of document the grandiose gestures that they made the night of the fire. And of course, we know the numbers don't speak to this like level of heroism, right? Because so many women did die in the fire. But actually, what's interesting is that a couple of weeks after the fire, there's an article in Baltimore, in a newspaper in Baltimore, because like I said, the fire was widely reported, up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And there's an article in Baltimore where the Baltimore newspaper says, hey Richmond, we look at these numbers and all of these women who are dead, and we say, that something's fishy. If this fire had occurred in Baltimore, we would not have had so many women die. Our numbers would have looked more even. And so these were really fighting words, right? And so Richmond's men get very flustered about all this, and they go back to the paper and they write more articles about how this is the fault of the women's dresses, that that they couldn't escape the building because their dresses got in the way, which is not really very valid, because early 19th century fashion was like these kind of gauzy, thin Jane Austen era dresses, and the men were wearing a lot of fabric too at that time. So we're not in like hoop skirt territory yet. And then they also said that they had been so chivalrous that night that they had given up their seats in the boxes and gone down to the pit, which turned out to be easier to escape. So the men in Richmond were kind of starting to come up with all these excuses for why the account had been, so devastating for women. And it's really not until about, I don't know, 100 years later or so that we start to get the accounts of women. Because of course women did write down their stories, but they wrote them in personal letters and diaries. They couldn't publish anything. So they, wrote about what had happened to them, and then those accounts ended up in shoeboxes under people's beds, right? The letters got passed on to their daughters and their granddaughters and their great-granddaughters, and eventually some woman is sitting there in 1940 with a shoebox and doesn't know what to do with it because she doesn't even know who these people are, right? And they start donating the letters to historical societies and libraries and archives and all these types of things. So we start to get accounts of women that are describing what you might imagine, right? Like they're in a crowded building, everyone's trying to get to the exit, and they're trampled. And that's not necessarily surprising information. I think, as we sit there, as we sit here in 2024 and think about what it would be like if 300 men and 300 women were in a building and everyone's just trying to get out, right? Men are taller and bigger and stronger, and, it's not shocking that they could escape, with a little more ease. But I think that narrative was very hard to swallow in 1811, because the women had been raised to believe that these guys were going to take care of them. This was like the age of Southern gentility and chivalry, and what they witnessed the night of the fire was not in keeping with how they had been raised, to believe that they would be cared for.
How interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is.
So Sally, can you talk about divorced women back then? Like what happened? What if a woman divorced her husband, that they were homeless, that they had no place to go?
Well, divorce, I mean, I think is barely a thing.
Or widowed.
Widowhood. I mean, her husband has died, right?
Right, he died.
Um, and so yeah, I mean, that was one of the, as I was trying to figure out, I knew that Sally Henry Campbell's husband had died 3 years before the fire. I knew that she had no children, that she had ended up being, the story goes, it's like kind of family lore, right? Is that she was rescued the night of the fire by a man she later ended up marrying about 18 months later. So we know she marries this guy, Alexander Scott. They go on to have children together. So, I had kind of like her genealogy, but that was it. And as I was sitting there trying to figure out, okay, what is it like to be a 31-year-old widow in 1811? What must her life have looked like? Why was she at the theater that night? Her family didn't live in Richmond, so who's she visiting? All these kind of things that I'm trying to figure out. I quickly went down this rabbit hole, like researching what it was like for women, widowed women in this era. And let me tell you, it was not great. It really, maybe it was even slightly better if you had no children. If you had sons, it seems like the worst of all worlds because your tiny son could inherit property from out from under you, and then you'd be sent packing, or your son and his wife would end up with your property, and then you'd have nowhere to go if they didn't kind of take you in kindly. A lot of women ended up, as widows, they would kind of go on the road and just spend years traveling and staying with different people as house guests. And I mean, I hate being a house guest. It's the worst. So the idea of just kind of being a perennial house guest sounds like a fate worse than death. But that this was very common for widows at that time. You were always just kind of beholden to somebody else, and you were not guaranteed of even inheriting the property that you came into the marriage with. So it was not hard. Once I had done the research, it was not hard to kind of piece together what Sally Henry Campbell's life might have looked like in these intervening years between husband number one and husband number two. And it really was in her best interest to remarry. And that's another thing. It's like, as a writer, when you're writing fiction, you, of course, you want to write a good love story, or you want to write like, the guy getting the girl, or the girl getting the guy, or the girl, whatever, but the reality is there were a lot of really pragmatic reasons why people needed to wed, and so as a writer, that's also got to be addressed.
So one more widow, Mrs. Cowley, Mary Cowley, was she a real person, or how did you base her character?
Yeah, yeah. So there's this woman in the book who is a kind of a healer, and her ancestry is a little vague, right? She's managed to kind of build a life for herself in the white community of Richmond. Um, but there's also, this suggestion that she may, have ancestry that's either Native American or Black, or there may be something else kind of going on. But she has this tremendous skill, and I learned about her because it's actually kind of funny how I found out about her. I was talking to a guy who kept these property records for the city of Richmond. So if you're trying to write a historical novel, let's just say, and you want to know who owned what property in Richmond, well, you can't just go to the archives and say like, hey, could I have a map that says where everyone lived? Like, that doesn't exist. So somebody told me that I needed to call this guy, Jeff Cartwright, who was a kind of amateur historian, and he had gone through all the old property records, which are all tied up in these little red ribbons and these little sheaths of paper. And he had gone through and created an Excel document that listed, okay, this property belongs to this person, this one belongs to this person. And I thought, oh, that'll be really helpful if I can figure out where some of these people were living. So I call up Jeff Cartwright, and I'm talking about my project, and he's talking about his project. He was researching a family called the Cowleys. And he says, I got a Cowley who was involved with the Richmond Theater Fire. And I said, really? I have not heard that name before, in all the research I've done. And of course, I became good friends with Meredith Henny Baker, who wrote the book, The Richmond Theater Fire, the nonfiction book. And she'd never mentioned a Cowley. And he said, yeah, I've got her obituary right here. Let me send it over. So he sends me the obituary for Mary Cowley. And it was published in like 1847 or something, which she died when she was 95. So, here she was providing care for people, and the obituary kind of clearly states that she ministered to many souls during the Richmond Theater Fire. But remember, the Richmond Theater Fire was in 1811, when she was in her 60s or something, right? So she died many, many years after the care she provided in the Richmond Theater Fire. Well, Meredith Henny Baker, I mean, she spent years researching this book. And of course, she looked through all the old newspapers and, but as a good librarian will tell you, these old newspapers are not digitized, right? Like they're not searchable. You can't, if you're sitting there on microfilm, like you're looking at 1811 line by line by line, then you go to 1812, then you go to 1813, right? Well, Meredith Henny Baker would have had no way to know that she should go all the way forward to 1847 to find this obituary, which clearly states that this woman, had provided medical care to people during the fire. But anyway, the result is, by this random conversation, I ended up finding out that this woman had been providing medical care, and that was really useful information because at this time there's no hospital in Richmond. Nobody, after the fire, no one is rushing to the hospital. There was, you just went to someone's home, and so people who had homes near the fire, near the theater, took in a lot of people because everyone couldn't get back where they were from. And so the newspaper would publish these accounts of, instructions. It was like before there were YouTube videos that this is what you had. The newspaper would say, here's the way that you should treat a burn, or this is how you should treat a break. And they published these articles in the paper to help those people at home who were caring for victims of the fire. So I knew I needed to all my victims needed to end up in someone's home. But then discovering Mary Cowley and the fact that she had taken in so many people into her home after the fire was this kind of lucky happenstance, and then wound up being something that I could weave into the story quite beautifully.
It was so also interesting to me. It's such a new learning experience. What surprised you most when writing the book? Was there any one character, or was there one character that was harder to write or surprised you the most? Or?
Well, I mean, I know when I stumbled on the information about the theater company blaming the fire on the slave revolt, that was a real moment where I was just like, no way. I mean, even though I know I'm writing about, it's a story set in pre-Civil War Virginia, right? There was still something about that I couldn't get over, right? Where it was just like, I can't believe it, right? So that was definitely one of those moments for me. I'm trying to think of other things that were really, really surprising. That was the biggest. I mean, there were all these little details I loved learning about, but they're all in the book in these tiny ways, right? I loved learning about Cy Gilead, who turned Gilbert down, wouldn't give him the mattress, right? That is part of the real narrative. And it was fun to kind of imagine why he might not have, handed it over, right? Or even just a little detail, which is just a line in the book, right? But the fact that the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians shared, their ministers, they shared a space, and you just went every other week, and this was all because no one wanted to walk up this big hill. So, those kind of details I loved. The idea that in Richmond, Presbyterians and Episcopalians would have almost become confused about what they were, or what it all meant, because they were just out of convenience all worshiping together. So there were details like that I had a lot of fun putting in the book. Anything related to 19th century theater, I enjoyed learning about as well.
So did they rebuild the Richmond Theater? Does it exist, or did they use it?
They rebuilt a theater, but not for about a decade after the fire. For about a decade, there was nothing in Richmond. It was far too painful for residents to, have theater troupes coming and going. And towards the end of that decade, you start to get evidence that, there were players who would come in, or, they'd maybe go to a local pub or some sort of other establishment, to a tavern, to perform, but it would get marketed as not being a play. It would be marketed as a speech or a talk, or because there was just this real hesitancy in Richmond to openly embrace theater. And then when we do finally get a theater, it's because a lot of these guys you met in the book, Thomas Ritchie, William Wirt, John Marshall, finally say, okay, enough is enough. We're going to fundraise and build a proper theater again. And of course, they don't build it on the same location because Monumental Church is in that location.
I also thought it was so interesting how they treated actors at that time. They weren't very important people. Like today, people, they have a different.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's read Booth by Karen Joy Fowler, but her book came out at around the same time mine did, also dealing with 19th century theater. She, of course, is looking at the Booth family. John Wilkes Booth was part of a very theatrical family. Most of his brothers and his father were in the theater. Um, and it's the same deal there, right? Like they're barely feeding themselves. They're kind of outcasts from a lot of other parts of society. Yeah, and no theater, and you tend to get these families where everyone is in the theater together because it was so difficult to intermarry and to kind of build a life outside of the theatrical life that you had established, that you get husbands and wives and children, and everyone is in the theater together because they just kind of form these little nucleuses.
The title of the book and the cover. Can you talk about how you came up with it? Like how you came up
Yes, of course, of course.
came up with the title? The title, I understand, but
Yeah, the title came to me about halfway through writing the book. I had another title that I had been kind of calling the book in my head, and when we sold the book to my editor at before I had written the whole thing, and I had this other title, and I could tell she didn't like it, and my agent didn't like it, and they kept calling the book The Fire Book because they did not like my title. And then one day I think I was working on the scene, where of course the actor announces to the crowd, the house is on fire. And if that line was pulled right from the old, inquest reports. And I emailed my editor and said, what about the house is on fire? And she wrote back, immediately and was like, yes, this is it. So from that point on, it was smooth sailing, but it took me a couple tries to figure out, one that would work. And then for the cover, I remember saying, as they were kind of thinking about different cover options, I said, I thought that it was really important for it to somehow convey theater, because of course the title, The House is on Fire, on its own doesn't necessarily mean theater. Of course, once you've read it, you know that it means theater. But so the art department at Simon & Schuster came up with that lovely cover that I think does do a really nice job of conveying theater and conveying the time period. And yeah, so I was really happy with it.
yeah, it's pretty. I mean, I like it too. So I don't know if I should ask you this, but I had read an article about you were disinvited to the JCC in Florida. Can you talk
Mm.
about that a little, like what happened?
Yeah. I belong to this great organization, or I mean, a lot of writers do it. It's called the Jewish Book Council. And the Jewish Book Council, they work as like a intermediary between like JCCs and synagogues and different Jewish organizations that bring in a lot of authors. And so if you are a Jewish author or you have written a book with Jewish themes, then you can work through the Jewish Book Council, and they will kind of help, put you together. It's almost like they serve as a matchmaker, and they'll put you together with JCCs and synagogues that would like you to come speak. And so when your book is in hardcover or when it's a new paperback, you can participate in their program. And so the year that The House is on Fire came out in hardcover, it came out in paperback this year. Last year was out in hardcover. They did a wonderful job kind of coming up with a slate of events for me to participate in, and one was this entity in Florida. And it was all confirmed, and but then I just got, it was a weird email. I got this email that kind of was asking me, we want to know what you're going to talk about when you talk about the book, because in Florida things are difficult and we don't like talking about the following things. And it was like slavery, black people, something like a bunch of stuff that made zero sense. And the Civil War, I think, was whatever. It was just too much. And so I knew what it felt like they were trying to say, that they wanted me to talk about the houses on fire, but without talking about the plight of black people in Virginia in the 1800s. And it just felt kind of impossible to do that. And so I wrote back and just said that, I would love to talk, but that any book talks I give about the houses on fire, of course, as you all have seen from today, it's hard not to talk about the houses on fire without talking about both slavery and women's rights. And so after that, it was kind of crickets for a couple of weeks, and then I was disinvited from this event. It was going to be some sort of luncheon, and and they were very clear when they disinvited me, and said that the reason that they could not have me was because of the topic, because Florida had become an increasingly crazy place. And I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but and so this was a decision that they had to make. And it's problematic for a lot of reasons, but this is, of course, at the same time, I mean, this was last year at the same time that Florida was having a lot of conversations about book banning, and a lot of conversations about taking, revising their AP African American history curriculum, and rewriting their textbooks, and kind of changing the way they talked about slavery and the Civil War, and these other civil rights topics. And it was troubling for me, because I felt like JCCs are private entities. Like, they can do whatever they want. They're not beholden to Governor DeSantis and public funding from the state of Florida. And so many of those policies, though, have such reach that what we start to see is entities like this JCC in this case, making decisions that they don't necessarily have to make, because they kind of think that they've got to fall in line with these policies. And so anyway, that was kind of, we ended up going back and forth for a little while. But I go to lots of other places in Florida. Florida is a lovely place, but I do think that I think we need to be able to have these conversations about our history. I didn't set out to write a book about slavery. I set out to write a book about the Richmond Theater Fire. But the Richmond Theater Fire occurred during slavery, and that's a part of American history. So.
Boy, I'm sorry this happened in today's time, and I'm sorry that it happened to you. It's
Well,
really
thank you. Thank you.
Huh. So what are you working on next?
I am working on a book set in the 1970s in Italy. My father was in the Navy, and so in the 80s, we lived for 2 years on this little island off the coast of Sardinia called La Maddalena. And I've been back a couple of times since, and it's just this very magical place. And between 1972 and 2008, there was an American military installation there. And so I'm writing a story set in this kind of American-Italian community in the 70s. So.
When do you plan for this to be published?
Well, it's due next summer, so I've got to finish writing it, and then we'll have a publication date.
Well, I look forward to it.
Thank you.
So I'm finished with my questions, but I see there's some questions in the chat. So let me go back to them. Elaine Hertzberg wrote, one of my favorite books is Florence Adler Swims Forever. That's so different than The House is on Fire. She wanted to know how you came up with the storyline for that one.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, I actually really like it when people tell me that the two books are very different, because For me, I've never been a person who, like, if I read a book by a writer, I never want the next book to be a duplicate of what I just read. So some of the writers I most admire are people like Anne Patchett, where, one book you're reading is set in an embassy in South America with terrorism undertones, and the next is in the Amazon, and the next is in Philadelphia or whatever. Like I want to go all kinds of places with writers and kind of experience the world through their eyes. And I think maybe partly because I did grow up as a military kid. I lived in all these different worlds as I was growing up, and I can't imagine just kind of staying in one place always. So that's kind of a little bit about my just philosophy is I want to be able to write, what I want. And I hope that my readers will come along, regardless, and trust me to just deliver a good story. Um, Florence Adler Swims Forever, for those of you who haven't read it, is based on another true story, the true story of my great great aunt's drowning. So I had a great great aunt, Florence Lowenthal, who was training to swim the English Channel she was a college student, and she drowned off the coast of Atlantic City. She was from Atlantic City, and so this would have been the summer of 1929. That particular summer, my grandmother was a little girl. She was on the beach the day that Florence drowned. It became one of the pivotal moments of her childhood. Much of the family was on the beach that day and kind of witnessed the horrific incident. The only person who was not on the beach that day was my great grandmother, my grandmother's mother, who was pregnant, and she was in the hospital on bed rest. She had lost a baby the previous summer. She was pregnant again, and the pregnancy was deemed high risk enough that she was in the hospital. And so when her sister died, the family made the decision not to tell her that Florence was dead. And they kind of went in on this secret, until such point as they, felt it was the right time to tell her. I grew up always knowing that we had not only this drowning in the family, but that the drowning had resulted in this secret. And in fact, my great great grandmother, the one who kind of spearheaded the secret, the story goes that she would walk into this hospital room to visit her surviving daughter, and that she never let on that her other daughter, Florence, had died, that she was able to just kind of be very stone-faced and do what she had to do, and that this was really a kind of testament to her love for her daughter and her, I don't know, just like her, her, I want to say something inappropriate. But anyway, so that was the story I grew up hearing, and I was always fascinated by it. And I saw all the ways that story kind of influenced my family even 90 years later. Like, we had all these things we didn't tell my grandparents. My mother would never have told them anything that might upset them or worry them, or there was kind of always this idea that you needed to protect people from bad news. And I was just, by the time I was a young adult and into my 30s, I was almost so confused by the story that I knew I had to write about it. And so that became the subject of my first novel, was, Florence. I'm not giving anything away. She dies very early in the book. But then the story is really about what happens to this family over the course of one summer as they are keeping this secret from their surviving daughter.
And I have to say, if you haven't read the book, it's excellent also. It really was.
Thank you.
So the next question here is, how do you not go down a rabbit hole when writing historical fiction and you have so many facts?
Yeah, we have an expression in amongst writers that's like, your research is showing. It's like your underwear is showing. You don't want to kind of throw in so much that it starts to read like a nonfiction textbook or something, right? Like it's got to be just the right detail at the right time where you believe it, but then you move on, right? Because always, always, always the character and the story has got to be at the front, right? Like that's the most important part. But yeah, I mean, the research is so fun. I think the danger is that you can end up spending all of your time on research and never actually write a novel. So I generally, when I'm working, even right now with the novel set in the 70s, there's still a ton I have to research. I was born in 81 and, missed the 70s and wasn't paying much attention in the 80s. I still have to kind of cut myself off and say, okay, Rachel, like this is a writing day. You've got to write today. And then, in the evening, if you want to read a book about 1970s politics or Nixon or whatever, go right ahead. But you've got to actually put words on the page, regardless. So yeah, they're kind of all these techniques. I mean, another thing I do is when I'm writing, if I need a little detail, like I need to know, in 1811, what kind of cup they were using to pour something or whatever, right? I don't go look that up in the middle of writing. I just leave a blank and I keep going. He put the blank in the blank and I keep on writing. And then I go back when I'm more brain dead and it's not my good writing time. And I'll go and spend 30 minutes figuring out what kind of vessel he needed for whatever. But so that's one of my tricks.
So Elliot Steen had asked that question, and he had a follow-up. What do you do with the leftover information you acquired and when the novel is complete?
It just makes me fun at cocktail parties. That's it. That's it. There's nothing else that I can do with it. Like, I mean, I wish. Yeah, and then also like I feel like I'm 43, but my brain is already going. So some of it just disappears immediately. It's incredible.
Oh, you're too young for that.
I don't know. Sometimes like I reread my work later and I'm like, wow, you knew all that, huh? Like, and then it's just, but that is one of the fun things about being a novelist is that, I spent all this time when I was writing Florence Adler, learning everything I could about Atlantic City and, Atlantic City in the 30s and open water swimming and channel swimming. And, I'm watching documentaries and I'm doing deep dives and I'm reading articles and I'm, all this. And then it was over and I stopped and I could entertain you for a good hour at a cocktail party with Atlantic City stories. But then, I moved on and it was like Jeffersonian America and that was the next deep dive or 19th century theater or, and I did that and so I can participate in a good conversation about early America. Not that those come up with that much frequency. But and it's funny, like getting to be friendly with the woman who wrote the nonfiction book about the fire. We have lots to say to each other because we're probably the two people who care the most about this stupid fire in all of the United States. But and then that also you just move on. So I think it's kind of it's fun. I look at people who are PhD historians, right, and working in academia, and they maybe kind of focus on one discipline forever. And being a novelist, I feel like is such a joy because I get to focus, but then I also can let it go and just move on.
Pam Gardo wrote, what a wonderful conversation. I love the novel and it gave me so much insight into it. And I totally agree. And thanks so much. She couldn't have said that better.
Oh, thank you.
If anyone else has any questions or they want to put in the chat or unmute themselves or. Thank you. This was wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you all for joining.
How interesting. It was really. Keep writing.
I will. I promise. Bye, all.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming.